Coming to our ReLondon event today. Thank you to Suez, by the way, before I start, for letting us have this space. And there's quite a few Suez people in the audience, so don't be shy, make yourself known, and do some business if you need to. Thank you to you all for coming here. We are delighted to launch our report. We've got a very few, I promise, printed copies of this. We believe it is, I often think if you say this, it must be true. We believe it is the first, the world's first consumption-based analysis of a particular material stream within a city or region. If you're very specific as well, you can make it the world's first. So I'll take that. Could you please turn your mobile phones off? And I will check my mobile phone is off too. And we are going to have options for asking questions at a couple of points during the session today. There'll be a chance after the panel discussion and a chance after the methodology and key findings presentation. Do get your thinking hats on. Think about some interesting and exciting questions to challenge our panel and our speakers. But I first of all want to introduce a short video presentation from Liz Goodwin, OBE, Dr. Liz Goodwin, in fact, who is our ReLondon chair and is also an SDG 12.3 champion and does work for the World Resources Institute on food waste, so is an expert in her field. She couldn't be with us today, and so she's recorded a short video presentation.
The statistics around food loss and waste are truly shocking. It's estimated that we lose or waste around a third of all the food that is produced. That amount of food costs the global economy $1 trillion every year. It causes 8 to 10% of global greenhouse gas emissions, wastes around a quarter of all the water used in agriculture, and is a waste of land covering an area the size of China. It also has a damaging impact on soils, biodiversity, and water quality. There's nothing good about it. And at the same time, 1 in 10 people go to bed hungry every day. How can that be? I find it really disturbing that more governments and businesses don't recognise the importance of tackling food loss and waste and the potential benefits to be gained. It's clear that the Paris Agreement targets will not be achieved if we don't tackle food loss and waste. It's also hard to see how we can get on a path to net zero without tackling food loss and waste. Very few countries even mention food loss and waste in their nationally determined contributions. And you'll see that the issue of food loss and waste hardly features on the agenda at COP26. The UNEP report last week is a stark reminder that the planned nationally determined contributions go nowhere near far enough to keep within a 1.5 degree temperature rise. With climate emergencies being declared by governments, local councils, boroughs and others, it's not surprising that people are asking what they can do to help reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Reducing food loss and waste is something that we can all do to help. Many of the things we need to do are quite simple. Many companies still don't realise that there is also a clear business case for tackling food loss and waste. It goes straight to the bottom line. Once businesses start to measure and understand their food loss and waste issues, they quickly realise the benefits to be gained from waste reductions. And for households, there are also benefits. Food waste costs the average family with 2 children in the UK around £60 a month. With family budgets being squeezed, reducing food waste could really make a difference. So there are win-wins to be had, helping to tackle climate change and saving money at the same time. Cities have a key role to play in tackling food loss and waste. It's forecast that by 2050, 80% of the planet's food will be consumed in cities. So it's essential that we make progress in cities. Without it, we will fail overall. It's for this reason that ReLondon developed this report in partnership with Circular Economy. It provides a clear evidence base to focus intervention at a city level. Everyone has a role to play in helping to reduce food loss and waste. I hope this report will shine a light on what cities can do. Thank you.
Great. I mean, there are some start statistics there, and what I'm going to do now is, in a second, I'm going to ask Sarah from ReLondon and Max from Circular Economy, who were our partners in creating this report, to come up and present it to you in some more detail. I should say that ReLondon is a partnership, a genuine partnership between London's municipalities and the Mayor of London. It's a statutory board. Liz is the chair of our board, and Shirley Rodriguez, who will present a bit later on, is the Deputy Mayor for Environment and Energy at the Greater London Authority, is on our board too, as well as some serious and big hitters in we think in the world of London governance. And so this is a topic that we take very seriously, and which we think has an incredible role to play in terms of tackling the climate emergency. And it's for that reason that we've done this report, to highlight the emissions associated with food that do not occur necessarily within the city. So, and I think that's one of the key insights into what we're about to see next. So I would like to invite onto the stage Max from Circular Economy and Sarah, who works for us at ReLondon. Thank you.
Thank you, Wayne. Really excited to be launching our report today and to be speaking at this event, especially in person. To see real people is great. So I'm going to introduce this section and give a bit of a background as to why we conducted this piece of research before passing on to Max, who will go through the key findings. So, why did we conduct this research? Well, fast-growing consumption in cities is a key driver of climate change, and cities and its consumers have a huge impact on emissions way beyond their own borders, which you'll see from our analysis shortly. In the case of London, residents are responsible for roughly 12 tonnes of consumption-based emissions for every person every year. And as a city, we're targeted to reduce our emissions by 60% to about 5 tonnes per person per year by 2030. And the vast majority of London boroughs have set targets to reach net zero emissions, and London Council's One World Living programme has been set up to develop an action plan for boroughs to support these targets, including a focus group on food. So London and its boroughs have very ambitious objectives to reduce carbon emissions. However, the evidence base, the tools and methodologies currently don't exist to support this transition, or indeed to sort of identify where we should focus our efforts as a city. And our role at ReLondon is to help accelerate London towards the vision of becoming a low-carbon circular economy by creating that evidence base to support activities which will help us achieve this reduction. And that's why we're working with Circular Economy to develop an analytical framework to link the flow of materials within London to their greenhouse gas emissions throughout their life cycle, which we've tested with a wide variety of stakeholders in this pilot project for food. And after the success of this analysis, we will then replicate this methodology to our other priority sectors, which include plastics, built environment, electricals, and textiles. So what do we mean by consumption-based emissions? So this analysis very much focuses on consumption-based emissions rather than territorial emissions. And what this means is that rather than focusing on emissions directly generated in London itself, so the producers of those emissions, we're actually considering emissions associated with the food that we consume or that we in London demand, which encompasses the entire food supply chain. And this sort of means that we are looking at emissions that stem from the food that we import into the city and the emissions behind their supply chains, but also the emissions from farming, from the energy required to operate our machinery in London's manufacturing, the transportation of our food across London, right up to the emissions from our waste management activities, and so on. And we've done this because cities play an influential role in achieving a sustainable future. And in particular, London's consumption-based emissions are 3.5 times bigger than the territorial emissions which occur within the city boundaries. And so it's critical that we understand not just the emissions that we're directly responsible for producing within London, but also those associated with the things that we consume. And so how have we done this? Well, we've estimated how much food is supplied to our city, where it's being produced, the types of food consumed, and the volume of waste at each stage across the supply chain. And then from this mass flow, we've then calculated the greenhouse gas emissions emitted across the entire supply chain. And essentially, this has allowed us to have a better understanding of the food system and identify the emission hotspots and leverage points where we can have action, or take action, to have the largest impact on carbon reduction. And finally, we've developed strategic scenarios to estimate the potential positive impact of certain large changes in the food system, such as food waste reduction and change in diets. So I'm going to pass on to Max Russell, who's led this piece of research from Circular Economy, to run through the findings and what we found. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Sarah. And I'm very grateful to be able to present on behalf of the team that's been working on this project over the past few months. And we're really excited to show some of the key insights of the report. So to start with, I'll give a bit of a high-level overview of some of the key findings before diving in a little bit more detail at some specifics as well. So as Sarah mentioned before, this project really looked at the consumption-based emissions of the food that's consumed in London. And by taking this approach, what we found is that 15.5 million tonnes of greenhouse gas emissions are emitted throughout that value chain. Now, what this means, in a different sense, is about the same amount of emissions as supplying fuel to 1.8 million households. So it's a decent-sized city for other terms. But what's really interesting about the analysis that we did is that we found that 78%, so the majority of the emissions associated with the food that's consumed in London, occur outside of the city boundaries itself. And that's the emissions associated with growing the foods, packaging the food, distributing the food, all to be consumed within the city of London. Now, the project also looked at a material lens and a material focus as well. And what we found is that over 1.3 million tonnes of food are either lost or wasted along the supply chain even before they reached households. So in other words, that's every Londoner having a footprint or a loss or waste footprint of 150 kilograms of food each year before it reaches households. So this hopefully gives you a sense of some of the big influence that London's food system has, both in terms of an emissions perspective, but also a material perspective. But what we did in this project is we dove a little bit deeper into the system to try and really highlight some of the intervention points and hotspots within London. So on this slide shows London's food system viewed through the lens of material flows and carbon emissions, where the green lines represent the material flows and the red lines on the diagram represent the associated emissions. Now, don't worry about fully digesting this visual on this slide. It's very complex, but if it does intrigue you, I really recommend to either pick up a copy of the report or download it online, which is launched today, to really dive into some of the nuance and some of the detail here. But perhaps one of the key things that I would love for you to take away today here is that it's complex. London's food system is complex. And so what we show here is the food that's supplied into London, either through imports or the food that's produced in the city. And we trace how food flows through the city in foods industry, in manufacturing, through retail, up to the point where it's consumed, mainly in households. And then we also, towards the right-hand side of the diagram, highlight where food is lost and how that food is managed within London as well. So by mapping out London's food system in this way, we can start to untangle some of the complexity behind the system and really identify some hotspots and leverage points to pursue more circular solutions to improve the sustainability of the system. So, for example, the vast majority of the food that's consumed in London, 99%, comes from what is imported into the city. And that's represented by the large green lines that are flowing on the left-hand side of the diagram. And this food comes from the rest of the UK, other parts of the EU, as well as the rest of the world. Now, what's really interesting is that linked to this, 78% of the emissions associated with the food that's consumed in London occur outside of the city itself. And that's represented by the thick red line at the top of the diagram there. So what this serves to highlight is really the influence that London's food system has and the consumption of food within London has globally, not just within the city, but its impacts globally. Within the report, we also dove in a little bit more detail as to the types of food that are consumed within or by Londoners within London households. So this is just a short version of the full list of products. But what we can see is that different products or different food groups have different carbon intensities. So for example, meat it makes up about 5% of the food that's consumed by mass by London households, but it's responsible for almost 27% of the associated consumption-based emissions. On the other hand, on the other side, you have a category like fruit and vegetables, which makes up over 20% of the food that's consumed by households by mass, but is only responsible for about 5% or less than 4% rather of the associated consumption-based emissions. So this really serves to highlight the influence of diets and demand on the overall carbon impact of the system. Yes, so as I mentioned, we also took a material perspective through the project, and we mapped where food losses and waste occur throughout the system. And as I mentioned before, about 1.3 million tons of food is either lost or wasted throughout the supply chain, even before it reaches households. But then also households are key hotspots of food loss and waste in themselves. So about 40% of that food loss and waste is actually occurring at the point of households as well. Now, linking the two sides together, when this food is lost or wasted, in essence, so too are all of the emissions that were produced up to that point to generate that food as well. We also explored how the food, when it is wasted, how it's managed by London. And what's quite striking, at least to me, quite striking to see is that still 65% or about 65% of food loss and waste is still managed by either incineration or landfill. Now, from a circular economy perspective, that's not the most desirable option that we can have. It represents a significant loss of value, both in terms of material value, but also economic value as well, potentially. So this, or maybe an additional point as well, is that the waste management is also a particular source of greenhouse gas emissions as well. So landfilling of food waste can be a potent source of greenhouse gases as well. So this really serves to underscore the importance of trying to reduce the amount of food and loss that occurs throughout the supply chain, but also improve the means by which it's managed as well. But we didn't just stop at mapping out the current state of the system. What we also asked ourselves is, okay, what if London acted upon some of these hotspots and pursued a more circular economy into the future? And what could some of the impacts be? So this is definitely the most encouraging slide today. What we did from those leverage points, as I said, we developed a few circular scenarios that explored the potential impacts from a carbon emissions perspective if some of those key parameters of the system were to change. So we explored scenarios in terms of what if we shift the demand from Londoners, what if we reduced some of the loss in waste occurring within the system, and what if we made better use of waste through different waste management practices. So the percentage at the bottom of this slide represents the potential food-related consumption-based emissions of pursuing that particular scenario. So for example, by shifting away from a more meat-intensive diet, which is also quite carbon intensive towards more plant-based alternatives, which are less carbon intensive. What we found is that that could reduce food-related consumption-based emissions by about 20%. On the other hand, what we found by reducing food loss and waste throughout London, within London itself, by about 50%, through, for example, redistributing some of the food surplus that occurs in the city, or by minimizing some of the edible food waste that occurred within households, for example. We found that that could reduce in itself food-related consumption-based emissions by about 10%. Now, on top of that, we also looked at what happens if London was to make better use of that waste through, for example, prioritizing composting or anaerobic digestion as opposed to landfilling and incineration. And what that found was that that could yield about a 0.4% reduction in emissions. Now, that may seem low in comparison to the other two scenarios as well, and it's somewhat offset by the lower quantities of waste making their way to the waste management activities in itself. But it's an additional 0.4% in total. So through this, it really serves to underscore the ability or the potential of London to pursue the circular economy and reduce not just emissions within the city itself, but also, more importantly, globally, the global source of emissions as well. As Sarah mentioned at the top as well, what we aim and our ambition is to replicate this approach, not just for food, but to other priority sectors of London, for example, the built environment, electronics, textiles as well, to really uncover some more intervention points for the circular economy and their potential greenhouse gas emission mitigation potential. So yes, by all means, more than happy to open the floor for a few Q&As. As I said before, we're really happy to launch the report today, so by all means, explore the report in more detail and download it. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Max. Thanks very much, Sarah. I'm Ali Moore. I'm the head of comms at ReLondon. I'm just going to chair this little bit of Q&A and then you won't see me again. So we can take questions from the floor, and we've got questions coming in online as well. So just encourage anybody watching online to submit your questions on the Slido, which is on your screen. Nice and easy to use, I think. Does anyone from the floor have any questions to start off with? We've got a roving mic. Adam.
Thanks, Ali. Excellent study, really interesting. The 0.4%, if you don't get the other leverage points to work, what is the scale of the 0.4 in terms of composting and AD for comparative purposes?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I don't have the numbers off the top of my head. It will be larger. I'm not sure it's orders of magnitude larger in itself. And I think that's underscored by the fact that the majority of the emissions occur outside of London in itself. So you're only dealing with, I believe that the waste management system is about 5% of the total 100%. So you're dealing with about that order of magnitude.
Richard? John? Richard has a...
I've got a loud voice anyway, but even so. Excellent, really excellent stuff. I mean, a sort of couple of thoughts. One is an observation is that the areas that you sort of highlighted for action, changing diets and also food waste, are areas where there's been some real progress already in London and around the world. So it does suggest we really can make a difference to the food footprint, I would say easily, but with real effort. So that's the positive I take out of it. I'm just thinking in terms of when you've actually sort of shown that 0.4% for the recycling. I'm just wondering what was really surprised you about this analysis, and what was your big take home from what you heard, what you saw, what you did in the report? Sorry.
Yeah, indeed, and I believe again that 0.4% off the face of it was honestly expecting a little bit larger, but then that's only from a carbon perspective. And I've seen some really interesting things flying around over this week of not getting carbon tunnel vision, let's say. So from a materials perspective and other, if you compost, you can use those materials to within the local system and have these more localized food systems as well. So although it's surprising from a carbon perspective, it's quite modest, let's say. I don't feel like it should be completely disregarded just because it doesn't make a carbon impact. I think it's equally important to support if you cycle that compost into local urban gardens, for example, to boost biodiversity. That's another benefit as well. So I think it's important not to just get that tunnel vision, let's say. So that was one of the, particularly surprising points in itself, as well as the 78% of just the huge magnitude of those emissions that occur outside of the system, and really trying to think, okay, how can London, what responsibilities do they have, how can they act on this, and how can they monitor and measure it to track their progress? It's really difficult when you start expanding it along that side. But I'm not sure if Sarah had any.
From your perspective, what was the most surprising thing?
Well, yeah, I was about to say that. It's definitely, I think the proportion of waste at the household wasn't surprising, but it was the amount of waste and the amount that we import into the city as a whole, I think, is something that we've maybe not talked about as much in the sense of emissions and waste as well. So I'd definitely say that was the key take home from this piece of research.
We've got a slightly unfair question from
Okay.
online. How do we persuade people to reduce consumption of meat by 70%, which is obviously a major ask. I don't think it's fair asking researchers and data analysts that question.
I wonder if
I'm sure
that's
we'll come on to that later when we
appropriate for the next session.
Hopefully some people will have some ideas. Any other questions from the floor? Yes, please.
So could I ask a quick question? I think it raises interesting questions about the role of procurement and knowing where your food is sourced and how it's dealt with in the supply chain. But I wondered if we address that 0.4%, what does it mean for the economics of energy from waste systems that are being put into across London?
Would you like to answer that, Phil? Is that what you're... No, you're just going to... I thought not. I thought not. Does either of you feel able to answer that one? That's quite a technical question.
I can.
I mean, so that it wasn't in the scope of the study to really dive into the economics of that perspective. But again, it's being aware of the lock-in that if you pursue kind of more waste-to-energy systems, that implies a certain time horizon to kind of lock with that. So hopefully this helps to showcase some of the possibilities. But again, it's out of the scope of this particular study. But I feel like there's a big movement that's trying to re-divert some of this funding away from kind of waste-to-energy systems.
Yeah, lots of complex things to work through after this report itself. Yes, so we have a question here, and then if we move on to Phil.
Yeah,
And
thank you so much. Thank you so much for the presentation. Just got kind of a quick clarifying question about like the food waste, like 0.4% reduction. Like, is the assumption here that like are we like assuming home compost, or are we assuming like kind of like a more like large scale industrial compost? And I'm also just wondering that if we're assuming like home compost, since like most people, like not large proportion of people living in London, they're like living in an apartment with no like local garden or something like that. Like, how are they gonna achieve that if there's like no local green space for them to compost their stuff? Thank you.
Thanks. Do you want to pass it straight?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, it's a good question. I think it assumed not home composting, but there's a really good observation as well in terms of that 0.4 figure. Maybe it implies certain things if you dive into different means of achieving that composting. It's more large scale in virtue composting systems.
Yeah, and you're right. I mean, behaviourally, we know people don't compost at home very much in London at all, and very few people even have green space, as you say, a garden. Phil, and then we have a gentleman over here, and then Ian, if we've got time. We're running out of time on this slot, but we'll come to you, Phil, please.
Thanks. So my question was, are there any comparators to other sort of cities or either in the UK or abroad? I presume, given the international supply chain, that end of this is pretty similar. But then so what can we do, I guess, as London would be my point of getting into that sort of upstream detail. And I suppose, and I know you're the analyst, and we'll have a political debate afterwards, the Environment Bill seems to focus almost entirely on expanding the availability of food recycling and the kind of waste end of this, which you've very clearly showed will have an impact, but it's a bit like my colleague in my road, like, you know, what at that end, well, we could spend a huge amount of money and effort expanding those networks when we should have been doing something around consumption, which I guess is the point of the day, but just any thoughts on that?
Yeah. Do you guys have any thoughts? Wayne, did you want to jump in there? Yeah. John, can we just have the mic for Wayne to respond on that one?
I mean, you're right in the sense that you know, the government do focus on end of pipe. It's a really important part, you know, as a kind of baseline service to be able to, for residents to be able to not put their food waste in landfill and incineration. So that's kind of, I think we probably all agree. And the number there that we showed is obviously affected by the huge number for the carbon footprint of food, rather than seeing it in its own territorial context. But having said that, it does raise the question of, well, how do we address the supply chain? And every city, I would have thought, every kind of major global northern hemisphere city will have a similar impact. So this is maybe something now we can talk to the C40 about, for example. It'd be a good opportunity to do that. So because we have an impact globally. So if we reduce that waste, we reduce that global carbon footprint. It has a massive impact. So maybe we should start thinking about how can we do more on and put more emphasis on food waste reduction, and what tools and techniques and opportunities do we have at our disposal to do that.
Great, thank you. I'm going to take one from the online audience and then this gentleman here, and I think we're going to close it there and move on, if that's okay. Somebody has asked if we know what percentage of food waste can be composted. My understanding was 100%, is that right?
What, in terms of the...
Going through the industrial composting process, did we get any figures on that?
We didn't go into that much detail.
No, we didn't go into that much detail, and the scenario at the end, or perhaps someone in the audience has an answer to that.
I can answer that, Ali.
Yeah.
Yes is the answer. If you're doing industrial composting, you can
100%.
Yeah. 100% could go through, just like 100% could go through AD.
Yeah.
So it's exactly the same.
Exactly. It's not like home composting where you have to pick out certain things. Yeah. Okay. And one final question from this gentleman here. Oh, Stuart, you're in. And then we'll move on, if that's okay.
Yes, yeah, I'm Suez. What we see in commercial businesses is quite a difference in their supply chain of food waste, depending whether they cook from raw on site or whether they get pre-processed, and therefore the waste is exterior. I wondered whether, if you looked in London, if London went more meat-free and more raw and cooked at home, actually whether you generated more food waste per se, because you're cooking more from raw, more banana skins, more that sort of process, and whether that had been any of your considerations in terms of actually that mass flow of change of behaviour.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting point, and it's it could have the ability of shifting where in the supply chain that waste occurs, and perhaps if it's more in London, then it's more of the autonomy and the influence of London as well. We didn't dive into that specifically and those impacts of the material flows. The scenario is very much from a carbon perspective, but indeed it gets quite complex. The more kind of granular you dive into it, the more questions come up, as any good study, I guess, should go into.
Yeah, I feel like we've got a lot of future research that we can do stemming from this MFA.
Lots of projects, so if there's any interest in partnering on that, of course.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much, everyone. Just a quick note that someone from C40, Catherine, has said online in our audience that she's very happy to take up the conversation around cities. So that's a good thing. Great, thank you very much, guys. Really fascinating presentation. Thanks for that.
Thank you very much.
So as Wayne mentioned, we at ReLondon are a partnership of the Mayor of London and London's boroughs, and we're delighted that Shirley Rodriguez, Deputy Mayor for Environment and Energy, has provided us with a video, which I'm going to pass on to you now. And she sends her regrets that she can't be here today, but we've got the video for her. Thank you.
Hello, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak to you all today. I'm sorry not to be with you in person, but I'm delighted to be part of this important event, launching the ReLondon report on the material flow analysis of food in London, especially at one of the most important summits for climate in recent history. You've just heard about the fantastic work that has gone into this report and the groundbreaking insights it's provided into London's food system. The Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, is absolutely committed to reducing carbon emissions, and food is a key part of this. He has set a target to make London net zero by 2030, and his London Environment Strategy has the target to reduce food waste in London by 20% per head by 2025, 50% per head by 2030, and to send no biodegradable waste to landfill by 2026. We're working on a number of fronts to achieve these goals, including with ReLondon. During the lockdowns of the past 2 years, we supported the opening of more than 50 food distribution hubs covering all of London's boroughs that aim to get food that would have been wasted to those who needed it most, so that nobody was left behind during the pandemic. And along with ReLondon, we're running a household food waste reduction pilot scheme that will use apps to measure the impact of prevention and reduction of household food waste. And following the successful awareness-raising campaign Trifocal, which helped Londoners in 6 boroughs reduce the amount of edible food thrown away by around 10%, ReLondon is now implementing an awareness campaign called Food Wave. This aims to promote climate-friendly food consumption, targeting young Londoners on low incomes. And I'm really proud to say that we're one of 3 flagship cities selected under the Ellen MacArthur Foundation Food Flagship Initiative, which is creating a consortium of businesses to develop and deliver circular economy-based solutions to lowering emissions. Through the Mayor's Green New Deal Fund, with ReLondon and the Food Flagship Initiative, we are providing grant funding and business advice to numerous innovative food waste prevention and redistribution businesses, names such as Winnow, Olio and Too Good To Go. And collectively, these businesses have already reduced food waste by 30,000 tonnes and helped avoid 150,000 tonnes of CO2e emissions. The Mayor has signed the C40 Good Food Cities Declaration and also the Glasgow Food and Climate Declaration on behalf of London. And as the new chair of C40, he's going to be working with cities around the world to create partnerships, share best practice, and deliver further measures to tackle emissions, including those related to food. And of course, we're following in the footsteps of Milan, who won recently the Earthshot Prize, so congratulations, Milan. But we know more needs to be done to achieve our climate objectives, and I'm delighted to announce today that the Mayor of London will be developing an ambitious action plan to reduce food-related emissions. This will act upon the findings of the Material Flow Analysis report and build upon the work we've already been doing with London's boroughs and stakeholders on their ideas for key interventions. The Mayor will also be convening a round table with representatives of the food sector that the Material Flow Analysis has identified as being key to tackling food waste. And these are food sector representatives from the supply chain. And the analysis published today has obviously identified these as having the biggest impact on consumption-based emissions. So we'll be exploring how these emissions can be best reduced and how to tackle the huge amount of food that is lost or wasted even before it reaches London. And as he's done on other sustainability issues, the Mayor will also lead by example. For example, we'll be using the purchasing power of the GLA and the wider GLA group, Transport for London, the Met Police and the Fire Brigade, some £10 billion, to measure and reduce the consumption-based emissions of our supply chains, including catering contractors, to help achieve this. So thank you once again for the opportunity to tell you a little bit about what we're doing in London. And just to conclude, report after report shows we're at a tipping point, and we must take action now if we're to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees C. Food is a key area that's often overlooked as too difficult. Today's report really identifies where we need to target, so I look forward to working with you to take action as a matter of urgency. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the session and, of course, COP.
Hi everybody. Well, it's difficult to go after Deputy Mayor Shirley Rodriguez. So I'm a senior advisor and food leads at ReLondon, and today I'll be talking to you about the Food Flagship Initiative. So the Food Flagship Initiative is a partnership between the Mayor of London, ReLondon, and the Ellen MacArthur Foundation to accelerate the transition to a low-carbon circular economy. Imagine London in 2030. All the foods consumed in the capital has been produced through techniques that regenerate the soil, store carbon, and protects biodiversity. In 2030, Londoners eat more vegetable proteins, less meats, and less animal-based products. In 2030, the concept of food waste has been eliminated. Edible food waste is completely reduced through innovation, monitoring in supply chain, and behavior change. And all the inedible parts, banana peels or potato peels, are recycled. That's a great vision, right? That's the vision of the Food Flagship initiative, to create a city where everyone enjoys food that is deeply valued, sustainably produced, and never wasted. And we do this in two ways. One is evidence-based policies. So using all the data and insights that you have just heard about in the study before, to inform and design high-impact interventions and policies. And we're working with the Mayor of London on the action plans that the Deputy Mayor just announced, working with Hackney as well as food lead of the London Council One World Living Group. So it's great to have Mayor Phil Glanville here today of Hackney. And work across different areas such as procurement, as was just mentioned by Shirley, infrastructure, financial incentives, partnerships, and voluntary agreements. But we recognize that we can't do this alone, so we need to work with all food supply chain. And we are convening a consortium of food stakeholders from farm to fork to reduce consumption-based emission. And one of the key elements of the initiative is to support demonstration projects. So we just launched the Circular Pioneer Project status, recognizing and supporting the innovation and the great work being done in this sector. And today I'm really pleased to unveil the three first demonstration projects of the Food Flagship initiative. So you might know Toast Ale already, and Luisa is here, so it's great to have you here, making beer from surplus bread. And they're launching this new project to go to the next step of the fight against food waste by creating a pre-prepared ingredients that other breweries can use and to reduce surplus food. The second is the Felix's Kitchen. So that's a new venture from the Felix Project, a food redistribution charity in London. And they will cook surplus foods in a professional kitchen in East London. And they will have the capacity to prepare 1.5 million meals every year that would have otherwise been wasted. And the third one is a project we are really involved in at ReLondon, is to test the promotion of food waste apps. So Olio, and great to have Anne-Charlotte here as well, and Kitcher, and estimate the impact that the local promotion of these apps can have on food waste reduction and also savings for the local authorities. So there's a big monitoring element to this project as well, to have some evidence to show to the local authorities that is worth investing in food waste reduction. And we want to support many more projects, so you can get in touch to join the consortium, or if you have a project that you want to submit, you can apply for our Circular Pioneer project status. So that's it for me. I'll hand over now to Wayne, who will introduce you to the panel. But don't forget, apply for the Circular Pioneer project.
Great, thank you. And I mean, I know this stuff because I'm the CEO, but it's great to see it presented like this. It really brings it to life. So thanks, Sean. Very impressive project. We're strategic partners of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, with Sao Paulo and New York, London are. So we work closely with Ellen MacArthur Foundation. So it's great to have a project like this happening in London. And what's the process for applying for a?
So there's on our website you can find it, and I think we can give it to all the participants after.
Okay, so check out the ReLondon website if you're interested in wanting to become a demonstrator project. So we're going to have a panel discussion now. So could I ask all of the panelists, please, to come and sit on the stage? Good to know that we have the right number of chairs. There's a moment of panic. I'm obviously meant to stand at this point. So if I could start with Georgia, if I could ask all of the panellists just to take 2 minutes to introduce yourself. I would say why you're here, but what your food story is, and then we'll ask some questions and have a discussion. So Georgia.
I'm Georgia Gould. I am leader of Camden Council and chair of London Councils, and really excited to be here with both of those hats on. I think we've heard a little bit about the work going on in London Councils, the One World Living that Phil and Hackney are leading on, and I think this report is going to help us look at the interventions that boroughs can make and the leadership we can show in London. But with my Camden hat on, this is a real priority for us, and we've during the pandemic seen the huge impact of food poverty, and one of our missions for recovery is that by 2030 every Camden resident will have access to free, healthy, sustainable meals per day. Now, healthy, affordable and sustainable, and that requires actually huge transformation, as we've heard today. Both, some of it we can deal with locally, but I think we need new partners to meet that scale of ambition and transformation. So excited to meet so many like-minded people and look at solutions.
Thank you.
Amazing. I'm Jamie Crumey, one of the co-founders of Too Good To Go. We are a social impact company that fights food waste, hence sort of why we're here. Our platform is really about creating a marketplace for individuals and businesses to reduce food waste. We launched the app just over 6 years ago now. We're in 17 markets globally, work with just about 120,000 different food businesses, and have rescued 97 meals from going to waste. So really what we're trying to do is, it's about, as I say, empowering individuals and businesses to ensure that perfectly good food doesn't go to waste, while inspiring people to think differently about food waste itself and drive that behavioural change as well.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Sarah Ottaway. I am Suez's Sustainability and Social Value Lead, and Suez is one of the reasons you're all sitting here today in this room, because we, like so many in the sector, are frustrated by the lack of waste and resources being part of the carbon agenda, as obviously Liz put it so well in her video to start with. We're also a key intervention point, obviously across the value chain. Once food becomes waste and is no longer being used, but also we are a collaborator. We work across value chains to understand how we can reduce food waste in the first place, and also make sure it's put to good use at various points in that process. And what we also see is that once we know that people are recycling it, we are capturing it, we're removing it from being disposed of, is you also get that prevention happening at the same time, because people see, whether it's a business who are recycling food waste for the first time, or a householder that has that caddy in their kitchen that they then put out on the curbside for us to collect, is they then realise, they see it visually in front of them, and it helps to stimulate a conversation, open the door when it comes to prevention. And that's a super important part of the whole resources agenda as well.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm Ian Golland. I'm Chief Exec at Zero Waste Scotland. We are Scotland's circular economy and resource efficiency experts. So our obviously relationship with food is obviously how do we reduce it? How do we cut out the carbon impact of our food waste right through the supply chain? So obviously we work directly with a number of partners involved in the supply chain. We work with individual businesses looking at their own operations. We work with consumer groups as well, trying to get the message across about food waste. We also work with the recycling and local authorities to provide collection infrastructure as well. So we've invested in collection infrastructure. 80% of houses in Scotland now have access to a food waste collection system that's been rolled out over the last few years. But obviously, a big part of our job at the moment is really trying to get citizens to understand the impact that we've all just heard about food waste. People might have seen, we've just launched a campaign last week with photographer Rankin to really raise the knowledge and awareness of the impact of food waste. So like wasting 1 kilogram of food is equivalent of wasting 25,000 plastic bottles, and our evidence would suggest that 86% of Scotland thinks that plastic has a bigger impact on climate than food waste, 86%. So the knowledge, whilst we all have to tackle plastic and plastic throwaway culture of plastic bottles, etc., single use, we have to do that, absolutely, but we need to get the awareness levels out about food waste and the absolute impact of that in an individual level and also through the supply chain.
David from Winnow. I head up marketing and public affairs at Winnow. So at Winnow we develop artificial intelligence tools to help chefs in big kitchens like staff restaurants, universities, hotels, cruise ships, casinos and retailers to run more profitable and sustainable kitchens by cutting food waste in half. Our technology works in a similar kind of way that a driverless car works. So we're teaching a machine to be able to recognize the food that's being thrown away. And we find when we're able to do that and then give teams analytics to understand where they're wasting food and why, that they're typically able to cut food waste in half within about 6 to 12 months. We were launched in 2013 in London. Fast forward to today, we're in 45 countries. Our app has been translated into 25 languages, and we're working with some of the biggest names in food like IKEA, ISS, Compass Group, Hilton, a number of other businesses. Like Too Good To Go, we're a registered B Corporation, impact-led. Cities have played a huge part in our journey, so really happy to be part of the conversation today.
Great. Hi everyone, I'm Christina Cannon. I'm a councillor in Glasgow City Council and I'm also chair of the General Purposes City Policy Committee, which looks at food in the city as well. So obviously food is really important to the city and the City Council, particularly due to our socio-economic challenges that we have in the city. So 1 in 3 children in the city live in poverty, and that's about 38,000 children, and about 11% of Glaswegians could name an event that indicated a food insecurity. So we need to look at how we can partner social justice with climate justice, and the best way to do that is obviously at events like this, speaking to partners from other local authorities, speaking to partners in other business sectors as well. So I'm really looking forward to doing that this morning, and just also a massive welcome to Glasgow.
Great, and thanks for at short notice being on the panel. It's fantastic that you're here. I'm going to roughly split this panel discussion into 2 relatively small parts, one on cities and one on business. And then we'll throw it open to the floor. We haven't got long, and these things, you know, they do kind of run away with you because we could talk for days, and this is a very complex issue. But I'm just going to quickly ask George the first question, which is, what is the role for cities? What do you think is the particular role that cities can play in this food waste and food loss topic?
Yeah, I mean, I think as we've heard in the presentation, crucial, we are the biggest concentration of people, and the kind of level of carbon emissions coming from food, and the really stark figures, 99% of food imported into London shows that if we don't solve this in cities, then we won't solve the issue. But I think the kind of flip side of that is cities are a place often of innovation where we can scale up, and a lot of what we've heard today has started in cities, and I think the opportunity is huge. And I also think that there's an opportunity around education. We ran a citizens' assembly in Camden on the climate crisis, and the overwhelming thing people had to say is we just don't know what to do. There's so much information, it's so confusing. How do we make a real impact in our lives? And I think that this kind of information, sharing this with people within communities, helping communities to take ownership of the choices they make and making it easier to do so will make an enormous difference.
Can I just ask a quick follow-up? I wanted to just highlight the fact that Camden had been a recipient of the Mayor's Future Neighbourhood funding just recently, and I think there's a food waste aspect or a food aspect to that project.
Yeah, so the Future Neighbourhood is an area called Somerstown, which is one of the most deprived parts of Camden, indeed of Europe, and our community have come together there to look at climate transformation, and we've won its I think overall it'd be over £1 million, and that will be to invest in 10 projects, and it's about a transformation to create a zero carbon neighbourhood, and a big part of that is supporting the circular economy, supporting food growing on our estates, allotments, turning one of our markets into a place where we can sell local produce. And I was in Somerstown recently, and they were doing an event with children, and they had these 2 apples, the beautiful shiny apple and this kind of quite gnarly looking one that had been grown locally. And it was telling the children where that shiny apple had gone in order to get there, and the kind of change in their mindset. They were making apple juice, and the community's understanding was really extraordinary. So I'm really excited about the work, the community leadership that will be shown there, and hopefully we can show what's possible.
Fantastic. I think I'm just going to segue nicely into a question to Ian around what do you think cities and regions can do, and maybe even in your context, countries can do to reduce food waste. We've heard an interesting project about local growing. And I mean, I throw it open to you. You know, I guess your focus is quite rightly on households. So what can we do directly to reduce waste at that level?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think our role, obviously, as a national agency, I think to some extent we're limited in some respect to the impact that we can have. I think, you know, certainly the work that we've done on the wider circular economy, I think we've had the biggest impact or the biggest penetration on that, working with the cities and the regions around Scotland, where particularly Glasgow, where you've got both leadership within the council, the municipality. You've got people like the Chambers of Commerce who provide an interface with businesses, but you've got access to citizens at a much more direct level. So for us, it's about how do we facilitate that? How do we provide them with the support and obviously some of the access to the analysis, the numbers. I mean, I think, you know, even putting these reports together like you've just done for London, how can we illustrate that at that level so they can act upon it, develop their own strategies, but also bespoke strategies particular to the circumstances, as we just heard about the I wouldn't say, well, all the cities are unique, and that's one of the things that we've really understood with delivering the circular economy with cities and regions. Rather than being prescriptive at the centre, what we think is the right thing to do, how can we shape that at a much more local level with the challenges and opportunities that are there, but also trying to provide facilitating the partnerships with some of the bigger companies and the technology suppliers. So how can we provide that almost interface, you know, rather than, with every respect, you know, companies having to go around all 32 local authorities trying to gain access. How could we maybe, you know, simplify that access for technology providers, for even waste management companies, or, you know, for new approaches to this in a way that it can be readily scaled up or taken over, you know, rather than all 32 local authorities in Scotland trying to have to work out what to do. We can, you know, hopefully simplify that.
I suspect that for you and for us at ReLondon, some of the challenges are quite similar in, you know, where you've got a big city, you know, that interface. It's really interesting. I know we've talked a lot about how we can work together, but what is the opportunity for kind of global action on this? You know, I mean, I've realised we've just gone from like very local to that. How do we save the world, Ian? But you know, there are partnerships and networks out there. So how do we utilise those to make?
Yeah, and I think, and it's interesting because there's a lot of partnerships and learning and sharing around the circular economy, but more on the kind of technical side of that and procurement. I mean, you know, I think it's already been flagged up right at the beginning. You know, with every respect, food waste, addressing the food waste challenge just isn't high enough up the agenda. I'm sorry to say, COP26 is not on the agenda. I've not, in all of the discussions I've been in and out of the blue zone last couple of days, this is just not getting talked about. You know, and you know, that great statistic that, you know, food waste was a country, it was the third biggest emitter of carbon. You know, you saw all that stuff at the beginning. There wasn't a leader who was putting their hand up for food waste at the beginning. And I think that's the problem. So I think, how do we get that? How do we get that same network, that same sharing? Because none of us have got the answer, as we've all just discussed. You know, there's lots of complexities about it, depending on circumstances. But we should be able to learn together on how we actually address this, whether it's technology, whether it's behavioural change, whether it's making those connections. And I think, I don't have the answer, but I think we've really got to find a way of getting this, whether it's mayors, whether it's prime ministers, whether it's presidents. Let's talk about food waste, the way we're talking about renewables, the way we're talking about decarbonising, the way we're talking about electrification of vehicles and transport systems and all of that. Why are we not talking about food waste?
Yeah.
I think, sorry, just to build on that point as well, is the importance of governments to talking about food waste at COP. You know, if we look at the national determined contributions, I believe it's 6% of member states have actually referenced food waste in their NDCs, which quite frankly is shocking. And so we talk about, you know, action and things like this, and frameworks are set out by governments, but it's cities who implement change. And it's the IPC report, which outlines that 50 to 70% of these actions are going to take place within local municipalities. So yes, it's important for governments to stand up and start talking about food waste, but the reality is it's going to be cities which are going to be providing this change.
Well, maybe if I could come to Christina then on that as another great segue. So, the politicians in the audience and on the panel have that direct connection with citizens and are charged really with some of this stuff. So I wondered if you could explain some of the things that you're doing in Glasgow in relation to working with citizens. And also there's a social aspect to this, which we don't talk about in the report so much, but it really is. There's a massive social angle to this, and I wonder if you could maybe talk about that.
Yeah, and absolutely, just following on from obviously other people's comments as well, that we think about these things locally, but in terms of we need to think about it globally as well, and consuming food is something that we do every single day. Do we do it with critical thought enough? Probably not. We just kind of, grab the first thing that's in the fridge or in the supermarket, and we just kind of take that for granted. We go home, we don't eat it, we throw it in the bin. So it is just about how do we take these statistics, how do we take this really important messaging and communicate it in a way to our citizens in Glasgow, but also much further afield as well, and that messaging will be different everywhere, but we can share best practice obviously in formats like this. Just in terms of what Glasgow is doing, we're focused a lot on food redistribution and reducing food waste as much as possible, so that we can reduce emissions, but also promote food sharing within communities. We fund 2 new community pantries based on the Scottish Pantry Network franchise model, and that is where people in communities spend £2.50 a week and get £15 worth of fresh food. That's also a kind of a poverty-related thing as well, but in terms of food waste, this food is provided by a charity FareShare, who I'm sure a lot of you know about, and this is food that would normally go to waste. Similarly, the City Council are also working with the charity Hubbub, who we are working to create 5 new community fridges across the city in areas of high food poverty as well. This is provided by the Co-op supermarket, and again, this is food that would just normally go to waste. We are also looking at a Food Connect project to try and transport food with as low carbon transport as much as possible, so through electric vehicles or through carbon cargo bikes, apologies. And there is also the possibility around digitisation of the food sector as well, about how we use data to really lower the impact that this sector is having on the environment as well. So yeah, things in Glasgow are going well. Obviously there's always a lot more that we can do as well. So yeah, that's just what we're doing.
Yeah, thank you for that. No, I mean, this is I guess a general question to the panel, so please feel free to chip in. But we touched upon the sustainable healthy diets aspect of this debate, and I just wondered if anyone's got any thoughts on that. It doesn't feel to me like we're kind of being the vegan police here, but it does feel to me that somewhere along this debate there is a discussion that we have to have about a sustainable and healthy diet, and I wonder who's best placed to have that discussion. It seems to me maybe that the citizens are a little bit ahead of us on that, but open to the panel really if anybody's got any thoughts on that.
I think also we need to understand, I'll jump in, we need to understand what that actually means, and there's obviously a number of different factors, as obviously the research points out, that link into that, but also we also need to help citizens understand, excuse me, what sustainability actually means when we're talking about in this context, because we see more and more research bringing it back to food waste, that as individuals we're not understanding and we're not connecting the impact that food in our fridge is having, whether we're wasting it or what's happening further down the supply chain. So I think there's the diet side of it, but there's also that broader agenda, and there's those broader messages to help people make better decisions that come into that process too.
Okay. I don't know if anybody else wants to come in.
I was thinking about it because I was talking to my local media yesterday, and they were saying, so what, people who are worried about this, what can they do? And I was like, well, they can eat less meat. And he's like, oh, it's the end of the world, and he was telling people to take away their burgers. So, maybe not politicians are not, the best place. But I think what was interesting about our Citizens Assembly and the Citizens Panel is they're designing a citizen-led campaign to get information about the impact and the decisions that can make the the biggest difference. And I think critical to link it to the food poverty issue, and there is so much food wasted, and I think initiatives like the one in Glasgow, and we've got doing similar work in Camden and in other parts of London to give people access to that food. And we're increasingly in Camden supporting people to set up food co-ops where they work together to buy affordable food or to get access to some of the food that isn't being used in supermarkets. And that's increasingly moving into recipe cards, cooking lessons. And I think the more that we can support people with the information they need and the access to affordable alternatives, the further we'll go. But it can't just be government alone. It has to be a citizen-led kind of work and with communities. But I think what's exciting is the energy is there. People want to do it. They want to meet the climate crisis. They just need the information, and that's why this work is so important.
I mean, I wholeheartedly agree with that. Which is one of the reasons, a bit of self-advertising, why ReLondon is developing a directory of circular economy SMEs, so that we can give or attempt to give citizens the tools and access to some of the businesses that I'm about to seamlessly segue into talking to.
But I think if I may just expand on George's point there, which is this notion that individuals can often feel quite helpless in the context of climate change. And we actually recently just published some research which found that 80% of the British public, they want to do more to become sustainably minded, but it's often not knowing what to do. And we talk about climate anxiety, and there's so many things we can do, but it's actually often about picking that one small thing that we can do. And food waste really epitomizes that for me. It's something that is so simple, it's so immediate, and it's so actionable that we can just be having a huge environmental impact just by reducing our food waste alone. But I do think on that wider sort of context piece, governments have to be involved in this. Local authorities have to be involved in it. Businesses have to be involved in it, and of course, it needs a grassroots movement with it as well, which is consumer-led. But it is this trifecta of different institutions coming together where we will find a more compelling solution. And I look at the UK's net zero strategy, and I think it's a missed opportunity, a huge open goal in which food waste just wasn't significantly addressed, particularly from that consumer level.
Can I just jump in there
Please
quickly?
do, yes.
Well? I think just building on your point there, you make I think the one thing that's missing on that is that unified message as well, because at the moment we're coming at this from multiple different angles, and each of those different actors that you've just described, local government, industry, we need a unified voice in order to push this forward. That's part of the reason perhaps we're not on the agenda, because when you look at energy, for example, they have three really clear messages. It's about renewables, it's about cost, and it's about making sure that we have a future system to support our economy. But actually, we don't have that yet for food waste. And if we can all talk from the same key messages in the same way the energy sector has, then maybe we can raise the agenda forward to get this higher up.
Okay, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to ask David one question. I'm going to come back to you, Sarah. I'm going to ask you one quick question, Jamie, and then I'm going to throw out to the audience. I know you've been sitting there kind of listening to us talk. So, David, the question I've got written here, and I think it's true, actually, a food waste startup generation is growing in London. By the way, I hope you're all playing food waste bingo. We've had takeaway, we've had growing, and appetite, obviously. So, and it's home to the likes of, we know, Too Good To Go, Olio, Oddbox, Toast Out, Entocycle. What makes London and other major cities such fertile ground for innovative food waste businesses? I didn't write that.
Well, I can speak a little bit about our story. And so in Winnow's kind of journey, we were the beneficiaries of a program called Food Save back in 2013, 2014, which was funded by the GLA and involved ReLondon and the Sustainable Restaurant Association. And what that did was it put our technology into about 90 kitchens. It got restaurants around London using the technology. It gave us really valuable feedback. And it allowed us to iterate and improve the product and make it more useful for the kind of general market. And it also saved 150 tonnes of food and 350,000 for businesses as well. And I think London has been doing this really well for a long time. It's been convening startups, innovation, technologies, and it has provided an environment for all of the different organisations to thrive. It also is a kind of a mecca for capital. And one of the things I would say about capital is great, between Winnow and Too Good To Go and Olio, we've raised over $100 million. That's great. But the kind of figures from the States, and I guess you could kind of import that over to here, $14 billion a year is needed for the US to hit its SDG 12.3. And this year they're forecast to hit $5 billion. So whatever that number is for the UK, and I'm not sure if that number exists, we really need to accelerate this in terms of providing capital to de-risk solutions and scale quickly. And what that will ultimately do is help get to the SDG quicker. We're pleased that some of our clients who've benefited from that early pilot program, like IKEA, have set a really ambitious goal for their Inca group to halve food waste by 2022. And it looks really likely that they'll be able to do that. ISS Guggenheimer in the US has set a target to halve food waste by 2024. And so what this does is it gives us the ability to be able to go and really run fast, but we need that capital at the beginning to be able to really kind of run faster, de-risk innovations, and have a real impact.
Yeah, great point. Jamie, I mean, you could answer that question as well if you like, but I just wondered as well if you could just say what impact you think you're having in London and elsewhere with your your solution. Over to you, Jamie.
So I guess the nature of our model is connecting consumers with businesses who have surplus food for sale. And we talk about the importance of cities. I mean, cities, what they represent 2% of the Earth's surface, yet consume 80% of the world's resources. And as a result, you could imagine the amount of food businesses that thrive in these cities to feed these populations. So certainly from our perspective, we want to be a solution which is readily available in every town and city globally. But we do thrive in cities alone, and we can see the impact that we've had in cities like London, in Paris, where in London we've rescued over 2.5 million meals from going to waste in the past 5-6 years. In Paris, it's almost 4 million. So we can really see this tangible impact in terms of the amount of tons of food which are being redistributed, but also the amount of tons of CO2e as well, which have been prevented. So for us, we can measure it in terms of this KPI of meals saved, but we can also look at the amount of individuals and businesses which we've inspired to actually think about food waste differently. And I think for us, that's something which is so important, is really looking at the amount of individuals which are now, or consumers or citizens, however we want to term them, how they're actually taking action now against food waste. And for us, it's creating a platform which is trying to take away these barriers of entrance to living a more sustainable lifestyle. Whether again that the same perspective can be taken for businesses as well. But as I say, it's really about looking at the amount of food that we've redistributed, but also the amount of businesses and people that we've been able to inspire to take action on food waste as well.
Thanks. So I'm just, Sarah, the last question that I'm going to ask the panel, but anybody else, please feel free to jump in really. So my question is from an industry perspective, Sarah, what policy levers do you think cities and regions can use to reduce food waste? And I guess, is national government doing enough?
Oh, that's a question. I think that we could probably have a whole session on that, couldn't we?
Yeah.
So in terms of national government, obviously the Environment Bill has already come up in the questions earlier. We're 2 years down the line from the Resource and Waste Strategy, and we still don't have, a clear idea of timescales and the full support that's available. Obviously, there's some mentions in the Net Zero Strategy about support when it comes to food waste. And what that means is that's halting the progress in terms of scaling up what's already going on, particularly in England. Obviously, Scotland and Wales are way ahead of us in terms of rolling out food waste collections, and that's like I said before, a really important intervention point in terms of preventing food going down the disposal route. But it also leads us into prevention and helping to open up those conversations at the same time. But the other part to that is around making it too easy. At the moment, it's far too easy to throw food away than it is to recycle it, and we need to flip that on its head, and that's where cities and local governments have a really important role to play. And probably the biggest lever they have, as much as it probably makes a lot of them very nervous, is around the residual waste collections. You know, at the moment, you know, you have residents, and there's an interesting conversation for us afterwards, isn't there? You know, at the moment, an average family does not need a 240 litre bin for the waste that they collect if they are recycling everything that's available to them, especially once we bring consistent collections in. When you look at the data that's out there, they'll need about a third of that for the things that are not on the list from what DEFRA are proposing to bring in. So that's a huge shift away from making that really easy decision of going, actually, I'll just throw it away. Food waste is a bit yucky, it gets a bit gross, you know, my bin's a bit, you know, it's not particularly nice or pleasant, or the flies have got in, and we need to turn that on its head, and that is the biggest lever they have at their disposal.
We are working with, I think it's Eco-Surety, Lambeth Council and Peabody to do food waste collections on some flatted properties in Lambeth, so that we'll see how that goes, because that would be quite an interesting game changer. I mean, we could talk about this for a week, I think. We could have a weekly conference on the issue of collection methodologies and residual waste.
Can I do the other
yes,
thing? I mean,
Ian, please come in.
I think I mean, whether it's councils, municipalities or the industry as well, I still think it comes back to, obviously, reports that have been out recently. We still need to tell the public what happens to that stuff that's taken away. I still think there's you know, we tell people, oh, it produces energy, you know, or it goes to compost or something like that. But I think people are looking, where does that go? Where does it go? And we can use that to tell that whole story. You know, I still think
that's a good point.
It's not just food waste, it's all about recyclables in general. I just think there's something, is a communication channel that we could really exploit much better.
Hopefully as well, the discussions yesterday at COP around methane and the packs which are happened off the back of that will hopefully throw food and food waste much more into the centre of these conversations.
Absolutely.
That's what I'm trying to say. People, I mean, we've all said that, you know, the general public want to be doing something for climate change. You know, they feel disempowered, they want to be doing something. Tackling food waste at home is one of the things they can do, but also if they are using a kitchen caddy and that, tell them what the impact of that is having.
I'm just going to come to Georgia and then I'm going to throw it out to the floor.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree with the emphasis on food waste collection. I think 24 boroughs now do food waste collection, and we need to increase that. But and we talked a lot about what individuals can do, but I still think that there's a kind of a lot of the emissions in that report. 78% was before it even got to London, and it feels there needs to be a policy intervention that focus on that supply chain. I think in the report there was the idea of mandatory reporting, but I'm really, you know, I don't think we've got a clear ask yet, but I'm really interested in what is the ask of government that looks at a regulation around that supply chain.
I think that's the piece of work that we could usefully do next. Okay, over to you, please. I'm sure you've got some interesting and challenging questions for our panel.
Hi, I've got a question for Jamie. You said you're seeing about double the impact in Paris compared to London, and I was just curious to know why you might think that is.
Yeah, good question. No, I think the main reality is it's just often looking at sort of the maturity of how we are in different markets. France is the biggest market which we operate in, followed by the UK. So it's quite natural for things to be like that. But yeah, I wouldn't put it to any cultural nuances and things like that, but more just about the stage of the journey we are as an organisation.
It'd be great if you could say who you are, by the way, and who you represent, so that we can attribute you.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Jo Hand. I set up Geeky, and we work with organisations to help individuals understand and cut their carbon footprint. And the food industry hasn't come up so much in the conversation so far, but they play a major role in driving our consumption habits and encouraging us to buy a lot of stuff that maybe we don't need. Do you think that collectively the industry and you guys representing your different organisations could bring greater pressure to bear on the food industry to sell what's needed rather than what drives profit?
Does anyone have a go at that?
Well, these answers is yes. No. I mean, I think they are doing quite a lot. You know, as we know, they're working with obviously RAP through the cultural commitment as well. I think they could do more in terms of taking the message out. I think that's more. You know what people do. I always look back to when my children were young. You know, the one thing they all read was the back of the cornflakes box in the morning. What, is a newspaper idea to get messages across to children, particularly, and adults. I think they've got more to do, I think, and I think conversations that I've had certainly with some of these big manufacturers, they understand that. They're just trying to understand what can they do, either individually or collectively. I think it's more of a collective message. It comes back to that point. What is the kind of 3 messages we need to just get across to people, rather than a whole myriad of things, and working together in a more collaborative way. So I definitely think there's more we could be doing. I think that's what we're all saying. People are focused on this to some extent, but I always think it's a bit more in a silo. Individual companies, individual sectors doing something. We need a much more joined up conversation about this, because this is a massive challenge, and it's not just a challenge for Glasgow or London. It's a challenge, as we've just said, all around the world. No one's cracked it, and it's to some extent, if you get a little bit more information from people like Liz Goodwin, it's getting worse. As the other countries develop at pace, the food waste system is increasingly getting worse in terms of climate emissions.
Sarah, you wanted to.
Yeah, and I think, obviously, a part of the work that's already been done has been based around a lot of voluntary agreements. We've got Courtauld, we've got Food Waste Reduction Roadmap that RAF have been leading on. They're doing some really great things, but they're only with a small section of the industry, the ones that are trying to do something about it. That's not bringing in those that are not playing that game at all. And actually what we need is more stronger policy intervention to really start pushing things in the right direction. Obviously, Georgia just mentioned about mandatory food waste reporting. That's coming down the line. But actually, they can report as much as they want. We need some more levers to actually push for change in the right direction as well.
Yeah, I mean, it does feel like groups of cities getting together in the absence of any other action is a useful and significant thing that can be done. Comment.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. Yesterday we were just launching a report as London with core cities, including Glasgow, on what we can do to ensure net zero cities, and waste was one of the parts of that report. So it feels like there's a real piece of work to be done on the back of this, not just the work that Sadiq's doing with the food industry, but more generally across core cities to use our weight as local government to put more pressure on industry to work with us to reduce waste. So I think that's a real outcome from
I think just reflecting on that question as well is, businesses are doing some things, and David at Winnow as well can attest to some of the great things which organisations are doing, and they're seeking out solutions to do more. And maybe it's just the optimist within me, because I think we can go down the route of complaining and pulling our hair out so much, but we are moving in a positive direction. And I look at manufacturers, and we launched a date label campaign earlier this year which includes the likes of Unilever, Nestle, Danone, to actually print on pack that once food has gone beyond its best before date, we should use our senses. We should look, smell and taste food, not waste it. But of course there's so much more to be done, but I think we should also celebrate the small things, which are people are rescuing food, they're redistributing food, they're measuring their wastage, and let's focus on that as well.
Yeah. And just very quickly to build on that, a kind of micro example. So our clients was telling us, listen, you're helping us measure your pre-consumer waste. Can you help us reduce post-consumer waste? And we launched a product last month called Winnow Sense, which measures post-consumer waste. And we worked with the London School of Economics on a behavioural change pilot, and we saw that we could cut post-consumer waste by 35% by using some behavioural science. And so there is appetite. Our clients are telling us that they want to have an impact. And so again, to Jamie's point, I think there's a level of optimism that at least we feel.
Great.
We've got 4 questions, starting with Josh.
Okay. You key them up. Yeah.
Hi all. I'm going to be a bit of a nightmare, and I've got a couple of comments and a question as well, if that's all right. But I'm Josh. I'm from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. It's fantastic working with London as a strategic partner. We look to you guys, and this report is an example of how you were a pioneer around the world, alongside Milan and Sao Paulo. I guess my reflection is we talked a lot about the waste and the need for food waste, but if we zoom out a little, food waste is a big emitter, but the food system as a whole is an even bigger emitter. And we've pointed to the intervention points in food waste, but I think we also need to think about diets and the steps before around growing and sourcing and production. And I think that's a really important point. I suppose if I use another pun, I would say the food system is ripe for
nice.
transformation. That's what we say.
Yeah.
So I guess I'm drawing on the question around what you want from businesses. What do cities and what do you as citizens see as the opportunities for cities maybe doing more of the production and sourcing? And I guess the mayor made the point about procurement. Is that a big opportunity for cities?
Yeah. Does anyone... I mean, that's a great question. So opportunities for local food growing.
Yeah, sorry, because I'm going to follow on that, because that was my question I was trying to ask earlier. I just wonder, in the report, was there any thought to that? What are the strategies potentially, not getting away from the consumption angle, but in terms of, yes, because there's a sense that there's little you can do because it's all outside of the city, but could you actually start to substitute some of that outside production by doing, obviously, allotments, people growing at home, vertical farming, farming on roofs, all of that. I don't know whether that's...
Sarah's got a whole list of research topics now.
Yeah.
But this is a really interesting...
It just fascinates me, I mean, whether that's 1% or 2%, and it's, but, for a city, because there's other benefits to that, they might not be directly, impacting on that carbon, but there's all the things you talked about, engaging with citizens at a more local level. The big thing in Scotland we talk about is the 20-minute neighbourhood, and all of that is just lends itself to just looking at that in a different way, rather than saying we need to go outside of the city and work with people. Actually, what could we do here?
And that's a key part of our strategy in Camden for exactly that reason, and the focused on our estates and where there is shared communal space. It's a way that it's amazing for mental health and community and people growing food. It changes their view of what's possible and their relationship with food. So I think it's a key part of the work that we need to do together. And I know in Glasgow you're doing a lot.
Yeah, and just following on from that as well, I think that what we were talking about earlier about educating people around food and kind of taking pride in what you eat, I suppose, and where that goes afterwards and where it's came from. I think knowing where it's came from and actually your community or yourself growing it has a huge impact on what you will then do with that, and the pride and the kind of thought that you're putting into food as well. So no, definitely I think that there is still a lot of work to be done in kind of shortening the food chain, I suppose.
I think it also comes back to the point about that we were talking before about in terms of what a sustainable, healthy diet looks like as well, because that all links together. You've got greater seasonality, but also that link with a healthy diet. We obviously things like fruit and veg, strawberries flown in the middle of December, huge carbon footprint, even bigger so when they get wasted. And actually, when you link it more into that local supply chain side, you can still produce healthy food that doesn't have the carbon footprint, but balance the two together.
So if I could just plug IGS vertical farming, just down the road, they've built one for COP26, just on the way to the exhibition centre on the right as you go under the Kingston Bridge. Absolutely a view of what the future might look like, particularly for cities. Big issue, not just in Glasgow and Scotland, around derelict land. What do we do with that? That's a massive opportunity. Modular system, use of renewables, but absolutely bringing, reducing food miles as well considerably.
Well, an interesting.
Absolutely.
We'd be very happy to partner with anybody who wants to do some research on that, because it sounds like a very useful topic for us to get some information on. Seriously, question here, please.
Thank you very much. Amazing conversation. I'm Carlotta from Trees Infrastructure, looking at valuing and investing in urban forests and urban forest gardens. And I'm just very intrigued. I think the conversation was super fascinating, but also somehow quite focused on quantity and how do we kind of really looking at amounts and numbers, using metric like numbers of meals and so on and so forth. And I think you mentioned now the kind of co-benefits that kind of local production can bring. And I'm really intrigued by how do we start bringing in other points of valuing different kind of food systems. When we start to look at nutrients decline, it's not enough to just say, let's just all eat vegetables, because actually we all know that I think there was like things like 70% of our nutrients are declining in also vegetable and fruits, or things like topsoil destruction. And I just wonder, how you think we can start bringing in multiple values. They're not just, again, quantity because of carbon emissions.
I wonder if it's worth just taking the last two questions, Ali, and then we'll just deal with them all as a package and then wrap up. So that was a question on there are other benefits.
It says that Josh has covered his question already.
And if I may, Richard's one from RAB. Let's finish up as well on the key messages to take away. And I was really struck by the fact that we've got these two areas. We've got healthy sustainable eating, healthy diets, and we've got food waste. And actually the UK is a bit of an exemplar in this. London is, the UK is, because we've already reduced our meat footprint by by 15%, our meat consumption by 15%. And we've actually reduced our food waste by 27% across the whole of the supply chain. And in the home, 31%. So I'm just wondering, as we're thinking about how do we take those messages to the world as well, not just this is a real problem, but yes, actually there's stuff that we're doing. London Trifocal also showed a reduction in meat consumption as part of that project. How can we take those messages to an international audience?
Okay, so there was a message on there's more to this than just that 0.4%. I think we agree. So how do we build that into what we do, and then how do we distribute and disseminate good practice and share that with our colleagues in the UK and the rest of the world? Anybody want to have a stab at any of those two questions?
I was struck listening. Well, go on, you start.
No, absolutely. I think that is. I'm not saying something being too focused on the carbon. There are other things, and I think. I'm not the scientist in this, but the fact that the CO2 levels are increasing means that most of the plants around the world are producing more sugar, so therefore to get them less than minerals inside it. So we have to eat more to get the same minerals out of our diet. We have to basically eat more, which obviously then it's basically supersized type of approach, which creating obesity, potentially all sorts of health issues going forward. So that in itself, financially, is just a global problem. So there's another reason why we need to tackle climate change, not just for the obvious ecological side of things. The food system is responding unknown to us to some extent, but scientists are now beginning to develop strategy, analysis around that. So absolutely, we need to start thinking almost outside of the carbon, framework, and think, what is this actually doing? What are we doing here? And how do we get that mineral level back up? And that's an interesting thing about this, the story about what happens to your food waste. Is it right to home compost, or should you be actually sending the waste back to where you're growing the food in the first place? Because that's the circular economy. If I spread home compost on my flowers, for instance, at home, that's great. I'll get better flowers, but I'm not eating the flowers. So is that, there's that type of conversation as well that we need to really think about. What's the best circular system that we're trying to create? So
and I think, Georgie, you wanted to come in.
A bit of a complex.
It's a complex system.
It is, and I was just struck by that last question, because I think often this debate can feel so overwhelming, and it's one where we talk about the huge challenges and the fears, and I think people can find that quite paralysing, and I think that the story here is kind of actually quite hopeful, and you can imagine a different future where people do get involved in growing local food in the community. There's real direct action that they can take outside of food, but you were just looking at some the launch of a library of things, and where people can borrow equipment, and you can imagine a completely different and more community where people are sharing a lot more, where there's a local market stalls selling fresh, affordable fruit and veg, and that that transforms so much else about how people feel about their community, their health and well-being, improve food poverty, or make it much easier to get healthy food. So I think the prize is enormous. So not just inspiring international audiences, but inspiring our own communities, and using this as a way of really transforming lives, and also meeting the climate crisis.
That's a pretty good description of what we call in London a ReLondon ultra low waste neighbourhood, which we were just discussing before. So thank you to our panel. And there's just I can't sum up. It's a very complex system, is what I take away from this. These numbers are a starting point for future research, and I think what we've also discovered is our impact as consumers is huge, and it mostly happens outside of our boundaries. So could you thank the panel in the traditional way, please? And I would invite you back to the floor. I just want to reintroduce Max. The question about how we disseminate this, we're kind of in the last part of this session now, so bear with us, is something that Max is going to address now. Is that right, Max? You're going to tell us about how this methodology could be used potentially by other cities. So I'm going to hand over to you and thank everybody.
Hello again, everybody. So yeah, I just wanted to briefly touch upon, of course, we pioneered this approach in collaboration with ReLondon and really dove into what it means for London's food system, specifically for London, but we consciously developed this approach to be replicable, not just for London, although it's particularly important, but for other cities around the world as well, particularly in Europe, where this is this kind of interaction between the consumption of food and its kind of broader impacts are so pronounced. So I just want to highlight and maybe a little bit of call to action in terms of this circle carbon scan is what we're terming it, in terms of this replicable approach to other cities to develop a similar insights and similar approach using locally relevant and kind of contextually specific data to kind of evaluate other cities around the world and measure their both food flows as well as carbon emissions, as we've done for London. But I think it's really important to kind of emphasize, as was brought up in the panel as well, to help contextualize it and kind of develop in collaboration with other partners contextually and locally explicit and relevant practices to be able to really reduce both emissions but also recirculate the emissions as well. So there is a QR code on the screen if you want to find out a little bit more information as well, but by all means I'm happy to reach out and contact myself. I believe a colleague of mine, Geordie, is on the virtual platform, and we're happy to really engage and we want to spread this type of analysis. We think it's really important, particularly during this COP focus on emissions. Really important to spread this type of analysis and these insights, not just to London, but learning from London's inspiration and to other cities as well. Just a very, very quick note, and I believe that I'm passing over to Pauline now as well. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I'm really delighted to have the pleasure to conclude this great and inspiring event. And I would like to start by saying a huge thank you to all our fantastic speakers and panelists. It was great to see such different perspectives and visions, and I think with all together, you gave us a really good idea of the challenge, obviously, but all the opportunities that we have and the vision that we should all reach towards too. So thanks a lot for that. I think there are two key messages that I'd like to take out from today. The first one is actually quite a message of optimism, is that solutions are there and people are already taking action. It was great to see David and Jamie, like two very practical examples of stuff that businesses and cities can really and citizens can implement to practically change things on the ground. But obviously, those are too small scale for now, and I think we all agree on that. So now the challenge is to scale those and make it the norm, to avoid waste, prevent waste in the first place, and redistribute when it's not possible. And for that, this is the second message, is that we all have a role to play, and I think the research really shows that, is that obviously there is a massive role for citizens. 40% of the waste arises there, and so we should keep pushing our awareness campaign. And in ReLondon, we have the Food Wave campaign in London targeting young people on tackling food waste. But I think and probably the biggest surprise of the report is actually the massive impact across the supply chain, and the need for us to now talk to businesses across the supply chain about them solving that food waste issue. And this is why we are really delighted with the announcement of the Deputy Mayor today about taking further commitment, so doing even more and taking out the main outcome of that study to really focus our effort, and in particular working with the supply chain and taking the lead on procurement. And it was great also to see the actions taken from the London Councils and have the perspective from Georgia Gould as well. And obviously we have all those players taking action, but you can all do it as well, you in the room, physical or virtual. We are very happy to support you in that journey. So if you are a food player and want to take action in London, please join us, contact us, and you can apply to become a Circular Food Pioneer project, and we would love to work with you on it. If you are a London Borough or even another local authority, municipal or regional one, we have just launched our Circular Economy Training Academy, whose purpose is really to take out some of all the learnings we have learned about in London, promoting circular economy, cutting food waste, but also in all across sectors, to really provide you with the tools to tackle consumption-based emission in your local area. So if you're interested, please go on our website, reach out. If you're physically here, happy to take forward the discussion after that event. So that's it for today. Thanks a lot for attending. Thanks again to our speakers, and for those in the room, come and chat to us, and I will be happy to continue the discussion with you. Thanks a lot.